Now, after the collapse of the Roman world in the West and Frankish invasions, also Burgundians and the Alemanni and all sorts of other tribes that moved in, these were Franks. And in the Middle Ages, Paris was controlled by a group of people who were called Merovingians. Merovingians. And we see this city that, in fact, the Roman city, which is showing up still in trace outline here, in fact, has been abandoned, and they have moved back on to the island with the cathedral church of Notre Dame de Paris constructed on the actual island. You'll also notice these two islands here. Again, these are sort of sandbars because the river is moving in this direction. In part of our story today, we will see how these islands were then actually connected back to here, filled in, and one of royal plazas that would be constructed by Henry IV right around the turn of the 1600s, 1500s to 1600s, would in fact be constructed there. That is the Place Dauphine. So in the 10th century, the city of Paris, very small, looked something like this. And it began to grow under Philippe Auguste in the 12th century to the 13th century. And it would be Philippe Auguste who would actually construct the hunting park, which is just outside the wall above the word Seine on the map, which we see as the Tower of the Louvre. Louvre actually is related etymologically to wolf, and this was apparently a hunting lodge that was constructed by the king sometime around 1200 of the Common Era. We also notice the walls here. These walls and the spaces that were at the base of those walls, again, the Germanic word bulwark comes into play. And when these walls came down, as the city grew outward, they would eventually be replaced by a French word of boulevard, which is where our word boulevard actually comes from, the space at the wall in the circumferential systems. And there we actually see along the wall here a space on the outside as the city began to grow here by the monastery of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. We know from documents that there were about 10,000 people that were associated with the monastery, not living here, but on lands that were controlled by this very, very important medieval monastic foundation. It was integral actually to the school at Notre Dame, which created the University of Paris here in the so-called Latin Quarter. Called the Latin Quarter, not because it was filled with people from Latin America, but because they spoke Latin as the language of the scholarship of the time and also of the church. This area that we see outside the wall becomes then the Faubourg. So Paris had developed into a burg, and thus on the outskirts here, the Faubourg Saint-Germain, and here the Faubourg Saint-Honoré. We also see the temple constructed here, the Templars, the Knights Templars, which we've already discussed, who are essentially the people who create in the late Middle Ages what emerges as our modern banking system, depositing money here, going somewhere else, and being able to withdraw the same amount somewhere else, right, through this kind of global network, which happens every day, of course, on the stock exchanges and so forth around the world and in banks around the world, even when you travel. This that you see here, of course, will become the Bastille here, which was a tower originally defending the rampart, but eventually is used as a prison. Now, keep in mind that everything that you see here on the right bank, this is the area here called the Marais, and everything that you see here on the right bank ultimately is subject to pretty bad flooding until you get up north outside of the city. By the time of the Bourbon monarchs, those are the Louis, but it begins with sort of the protagonist of our story today, a man who was actually originally from Spain named Henry of Navarre. That's the northern province of Spain. And Henry ends up becoming the first, sets up the Bourbon dynasty, the Bourbon monarchs, at the end of the religious wars of the 1500s. France had been racked with these internal civil wars between the Protestant elements and the Catholic elements, Roman Catholic elements. In fact, Henry actually converted from Catholicism to Protestantism and back to Catholicism twice. His famous quote was, "What is a mass for a kingdom?" He really sets up what becomes sort of the sequence of events that ultimately will lead to the consolidation of France, and France will emerge in the world as the first modern nation state. What do I mean by that? Everybody's speaking pretty much the same language. You have borders that pretty much conformed, except for the Alsace and Lorraine to the east, which was part German around Strasbourg. You actually have everybody speaking a common language. You have borders that look pretty much like what it is today. You have a central administration and so forth, and that occurs under the Bourbon monarchs. Now, it wasn't a smooth transition. There were periods of time when there were riots and revolutions that were squelched. But the succession goes from Henry IV, Henri IV, to his son Louis XIII, and from Louis XIII to Louis XIV, from Louis XIV to the 15th, and then the 16th, who got his head cut off in 1791, actually, with the Revolution of 1789, the French Revolution that ended the monarchy. Took 50 years to get rid of it completely, but ended the monarchy as a form of government in France. You can see here that the city has grown outside of its original sort of medieval walls. There we see the space where the wall was. And we notice the Louvre here, which was outside of the wall. And you'll notice that there's actually an extension of that, which is coming down and across here, called the Palais de Tuileries, the Garden of the Tuileries. The palace and the Tuileries that we see up here was a garden that was associated that will come into play on Friday. Today, however, what I want to focus on is what happens in the reign of Henry IV, the first Bourbon monarch. He is secure. He is married to a Medici, Marie de Medici, who is from Florence, who grew up in the Boboli Gardens, the Pitti Palace in Florence. She is 4'11" and weighs 280 pounds. Okay, and she is the mother of Louis XIII. Henry wants to build it. Paris stinks. That's the best way to put it. It stinks. I mean, the river has human waste in it. You can't really drink from it. There's no adequate water supply. It's flooding into all these cesspits over here. It's a medieval city. And to create a capital of this emerging nation that he dreamed of, he wanted to actually create, in fact, something which was worthy of such a capital, to edify, that term again. And we've seen this in Florence. We see this with Sixtus V in Rome. And they are contemporaries. Sixtus V, 1585, is at the beginning of the reign of Henry IV. Henry will die prematurely in 1610, and some of these projects will not be realized, but I want to go through the sequence of these today that were begun under Henry IV. The first of these is the Place Dauphine. Dauphine is the feminine form of Dauphin, Dauphin being the prince, Dauphine being attached to the place. The place was feminine, so Dauphine, but it's actually named after his son Louis XIV, the Dauphin. And you'll notice that there's a new bridge. Not only have these islands that were there as like sandbars, sort of like sandbars coming down the river here They have now been, this retaining wall has been constructed as part of a major project spanning building a new bridge. So there were only these two old bridges which had buildings on them, one of which here was built by the Romans. Later, this island will actually be consolidated from a variety of smaller islands and will become the Ile Saint-Louis. In the Place Dauphine, this has been consolidated, and the king wants to build a project which will be similar to the things that he has seen in Florence and in Rome. And this will be the Place Dauphine. The second of these projects will be the Place Royale, which will, after the revolution of 1789, will change its name, and today is known as the Place des Vosges, Vosges, Vosges. There are other protagonists in the story that come after the king, including Cardinal Armand de Plessis de Richelieu. Richelieu was an extraordinary man who, at the age of 18, at a very early age, had been sent as a as an emissary of the throne of France to the papacy in Rome, and he was in Rome at the time that these sort of plans of Sixtus V were being put into place, and at the beginning of the Baroque period in Rome that brought all these fountains and so forth into being in the city. And he returned during the minor reign of Louis XIII after the death of Henry IV, and was in effect the head of state. Even though they had a king, king was 13 years old, and queen was still alive, but Richelieu is really running France, and Richelieu really set up what would become then the Bourbon monarchy as it passed on through Louis XIII and Louis XIV. But as an example, he built himself a house for himself here, which today is known as the Palais Royal, but at the time was known as the Palais Cardinal. And look at where it is. It's directly opposite the Louvre. There we see it in the green, the Palais Cardinal, today known as Palais Royal, with a rather elaborate garden behind it, basically sending a signal to the monarch, saying, and to the nobility, saying, you know, this is the example. This is how you need to build. This is how you need to live. If you want to emerge as a major player in European politics, time, so forth, then you need to behave that way. And that includes dressing properly, it includes proper manners, but it also includes building in a certain way. We see this over and over and over again. It's not unusual. It is not unusual in the least. Now, there's another one down here that we won't talk about today, but I want to mention, and that is the Hotel de Luxembourg, which was built by Henry IV's queen after his death, which consolidated an old convent and some other property here, and built the Palais de Luxembourg here. She was living out at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, way downstream and around the bend from Paris. And she moved back into the city, had her agents acquire this property, and she built a palais here that was more or less based upon the design of her childhood home in Florence. This will not really become significant in this course just yet, but these gardens, which were built as royal gardens, pleasure gardens, here and here, the Tuileries and the Luxembourg, will, after the revolution, be put into public service as public parks. And so I want to foreshadow that, because we will see the way in which these new kinds of public spaces in the 19th century begin to be constructed, originally out of the confiscated grounds of the nobility, but eventually where taxes are levied, and people are donating property and so forth, to create these public parks all around the industrialized world as cities begin to really grow. Today, we want to focus on the Place Dauphine and the Place Royale and the immediate descendants of that. The first, Place Dauphine, was integral to the project of the construction of this new bridge, the Pont Neuf, which the king had conceived of in the late 1500s, around 1597, so that in the engineering and construction of the bridge, they went ahead and created walls, retaining walls around here, which they could then backfill, and then the insertion of this royal place. Now, this was residential. So in Italy, what we saw in Rome, for example, is that all of these obelisks were associated with churches, or they were associated with other kinds of objects of antiquity, but public buildings of one sort or another. Here, however, it is not associated with a public building. It is, in fact, a residential structure because he wanted to create a means by which he would then develop this and get the nobility to have a, quote, townhouse, a house in the city where he could keep an eye on them. So he didn't trust them all. Things are still kind of shaky politically. It's not very stable. Critical to this was a statue, an equestrian statue of the king that was to be placed here facing back as if he was keeping an eye. You know, it's like me looking at you, like keeping an eye on you. And so an equestrian statue based upon the precedent of Marcus Aurelius at the Campidoglio in Rome is placed here on the Pont Neuf. The statue was manufactured in Italy and was not erected until after the king's death. This project, because of the complexities of engineering, actually was not complete at the time the king passed away. But this one was, even though it started second after the Place Dauphine. The Place Royale was conceived roughly at the same time, a couple of years later, but it actually opened. It was actually built before the other one because of the relative ease of construction in relation to all the engineering that had to be done around the Pont Neuf and the building up of the island. There we see then the alignment of the walls. These are sort of the nascent boulevards. So we'll begin with the Place Dauphine between 1578 and 1607. And there you see actually from the Legrand map of 1380, the islands here that were built up. This is actually then a huge retaining wall that is constructed around here, and a bridge, the Pont Neuf, is constructed across the river here. Unlike the other bridges, the older bridges that we see in the upper part of this here, these would not have buildings on them. The Pont Neuf would actually be extraordinarily wide for the time and would actually contain sidewalks. All the Roman sidewalks had been filled in, disappeared over on the left bank, and this would be the first new construction to actually contain sidewalks. There we actually see it as it ultimately appeared at completion, with this range of residential buildings that we see here, these townhouses, and there we see the statue of the king here in the Pont Neuf. There is that retaining wall, which then consolidated the Ile de la Cité. There we see Notre Dame at the top, and this is Sainte-Chapelle that we see right here, and the Hotel de Tournelle and all these other sort of famous buildings that are constructed there on the island. Now you'll notice an odd thing about this. They couldn't quite get this to be a perfect triangle, and the bridge doesn't actually line up with it, and that created some problems for them that we'll come to in a moment. But notice that the Parvis of Notre Dame still retains its medieval form. Today it has been cleared all the way back to the Rue Saint-Jacques. This entire area that we see here has been cleared out, as I showed you earlier. So Henry IV begins construction in 1578. Work is suspended during the religious wars and resumed 20 years later in 1598. The design is finalized in 1602. Now, the king himself did not build this. He actually turned it over to one of his ministers, his finance minister, a man named Achille de Harlay, Harlay. And Harlay acted as a developer, a real estate developer. Actually capitalizing, the land was given by the king. The royal treasury kicked in some money. He got some other investments, tried to pre-sell some of these units, never very successful. But that was what actually was associated with this. So Arles is actually now not the king, not the pope, but actually an agent, a person representing the interests of capital in this case, under land that is granted by the king, acting in effect as a real estate developer on a speculative housing project, which was expected to make a return on the investment. Extraordinary, right? This difference between the piazzas of Rome and the royal plazas was likely to be on a test. You are lucky that your test is not down here and that you are here so that you know to study that. What's the difference between the piazzas of Baroque Rome and the royal plazas of France at the same time? Anybody? Use. One is associated with public buildings. What's the other one associated with? Residential. There you go. Domestic. Very different. There's a huge difference between building a residential building up here on Peachtree Street and building a city hall or a state capitol or something like that. Right? A dome for the Falcons to play in. Right? Just one little factoid that I think is fascinating. As far as we know, between the 6th century when they finally ended, the 7th century when they ended the games in the arena, the Colosseum in Rome, and the emergence of the modern Olympics in 1896 in Athens, Greece, there was no building constructed anywhere in the world specifically designed for a sporting event. That doesn't mean they didn't actually have sporting events. It means that they were not spectator sports. The public didn't buy a ticket to go see the game. And if we think about that in the 20th century, and we think about just starting with the Olympics, I mean, look at what London built for the last Olympics, right? On the East End, uncovering streams, building new venues, building stadia, building dormitories, building new housing blocks. And look at what China built before that. And then look at what Sydney, Australia built before that. Then we're back to Atlanta. What did we build? Not much. A whole bunch of dormitories on the Georgia Tech campus, a swimming pool, because that was the Georgia Tech campus was the village, the Olympic Village. So what you got out of it was a swimming pool, SAC, right, which was the Olympic swimming venue. It was open air when it was built. And a whole lot, otherwise it was an Olympics in a tent, you know. Turner Field, which was half of where the Braves play. And that's about it. But the point being that we already had a lot of, I mean, look at the largest buildings on the Georgia Tech campus. What are they? Well, what's the largest building on the Georgia Tech campus? I would say it's probably Bobby Dodd Stadium, huh? Right? What's the next largest? Where do you graduate? Camish Pavilion, right? Et cetera, et cetera. If you go to around the world today, there's huge amounts of capital investment being built all over the world to build these sporting venues, right? Everywhere. Kuwait, London, Sydney, Brazil, wherever. Huge. And I think it's fascinating that there was this long hiatus between the 7th century and the late 19th, early 20th centuries when there were no buildings like that built. There were places, as we'll see, places where you had jousting tournaments, and there were places where people would gather, and there were sort of these medieval fairs and so forth, and bullfights, but nothing, nothing like what we have today and what emerges in the 20th century. So, in any event, there are these sort of significant changes. I have no idea the significance of what I just said. I have absolutely no idea. I know that in the Middle Ages, there was a kind of competition in France between all these towns, among all these towns, like Chartres and Reims and so forth, to build these great Gothic cathedrals. And there was a huge market to get a relic of a saint. If you had a relic, a little finger, a skull preferably, something that was associated, that could attract people, that was considered investment as what today we would call economic development. And that's sort of the same thing that I think we see with these sporting venues. You really want to be a major league city, you better have what? A major league team, right? And they're willing to mortgage their children's future to get them here, right? Pretty much. Okay. So this is actually unusual in that it is in fact this residential space, but it uses these Renaissance principles of perspectival space. It's drawing upon precedents that we have seen in Italy, right down to the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius disguised as Henry IV. Right? So construction begins, and you can read this, but he delivers to Achille d'Arles, the president of the parliament, what amounts to about 3 acres, or about 1.2 hectares, for the purpose of developing a speculative residential real estate complex aimed at attracting wealthy landowners to an urban townhouse. While the model is clearly Rome and the Piazza of the Campidoglio, the program is completely different. I found that very significant. Now, for the architects in here, okay, business majors, civil engineers, you don't have to worry about this. Maybe civil engineers. But at some point, you've got to realize if you're going to use a known geometric figure, then these two things have to be parallel, right? Or that dimension has to be different in order to get the axis to line up with the thing that you're trying to line it up with. And what they did is they clearly favored the geometry of the bulkhead here rather than, and then they tried to insert this regularized figure on the inside without expanding or contracting the depth of the buildings. And the result was it couldn't quite get it lined up. And I found that sort of interesting. There's a simple way to have done that, which would have been simply to shift everything over. These kinds of little geometric moves are not important unless you are an architect, but they are very important if you are an architect. And we'll see what Daniel Burnham did in Washington, D.C. to disguise the fact that the mall is in fact 2 degrees off axis with the Capitol. Okay, it's fascinating. That just shows you how to do it. So here is actually the Turgot map, very famous map of 1734, showing the ensemble of bridge, statue, and place all together. There's the bridge. There is the statue, and the statue is looking where? Back into the place. Again, the French name for piazza. Now, none of the houses, in fact, these two that we see are reconstructions of the original buildings, sort of a reverse historic preservation. They tore them down and then they kind of built them back in order to preserve what was there originally, because it's very significant. But at the end of this, the end of the axis from the statue, from the equestrian statue, that range of buildings, this range of buildings that you see right here was actually removed and was replaced by the Supreme Court of France, the Palais de Justice, in the 19th century. You can see here how it's catawampus, right? And today, just this grove of trees, it's all very pleasant. There's sort of cafes. Jean-Paul Sartre, the existential philosopher, lived right here and used to spend a lot of time out there writing about nothing, being and nothingness or something, right? Sitting under the trees, drinking coffee and smoking Gauloise. And there you can actually, again, see the rotation in order to get the axis is a little bit of a problem. And there it is today in its final form with the Palais de Justice here at the end, and then the two ranges of buildings. Now you'll notice these firewalls in between, very different from what we would see in Italy, where you would have basically what amounts to a Roman insula occupying an entire block or palazzo, into, taking up the whole thing. Here it's divided up into individual units. More on that later, because it has fairly profound urban implications. London is all this townhouse arrangement. The Mediterranean world is not, and Paris ends up being a kind of hybrid. If you have an insula, what can you put on the ground floor very easily? Anybody? Shops facing out to the street, right? How do you do that in a townhouse? I open the door, I'm inside my living room. Not real easy, right? It has different implications of how residential and retail uses are actually combined. And it's a function of building type. Well, as I mentioned, the second one of these planned roughly at the same time, but because of the complexities and interruptions in the construction of the Place Dauphine, the Place Royale, which begins in 1605, actually opens just before the king's death and is finally ready, completed for its certificate of occupancy, I suppose, in 1612. Now, it's very different. It's basically a square that we see here with a range of buildings with a street moving through the top. And then there is a pavilion of the queen and a pavilion of the king on either end, although neither one of them ever lived there. This is a very expensive and nice hotel. If you go to Paris, you have $380, you can actually spend the night there. I've never done it. This is the street, though, that comes through, and then you have this ground floor arcade. Now, the scheme here, it depends on who you read, but the scheme here was to create either a silk factory or a velour factory. Silk, most likely, and that's what the majority of historians believe. And this will coin a phrase that I will introduce now that will come into play in the 19th century, quoting Lewis Mumford: out front, fine silk, and in the back, tuberculosis. These were to be actually the residences of wealthy nobles, people involved in import-export, manufacturing, who were basically running sweatshops back here. But the scheme never actually worked out. So the silk manufacturing part of it never actually worked out. And rather what we ended up with was this sort of residential square arcaded completely on the ground floor. And this will become a precedent for Covent Garden later in London. This is the view of the Place Royale. This is now called Place de Vosges. And here it's sort of interesting architecturally, because while you have the individual townhouse, which is given away by the fact that you have different chimneys and roofs, there's an attempt here to kind of unify the facade. But the king died, they ran out of money. All this was supposed to be brick. They never could actually finish it in brick. So it's actually tooled plaster in some cases to look like brick. This giant equestrian statue of the Dauphin, Louis XIII, there. This is actually his marriage in 1615, when he was something like, I guess he'd be about 18 years old at that point, or 20 years old. And you can see how these spaces were used. They were used by the nobility for these events, such as the wedding of a king. They were not open to the public in the sense that we would define that term today. The public meaning everybody. At this point in time, the public meant those that were in proximity to the king. There you can actually see then the backs of these, which were intended to actually be parts of these workshops for the construction or for the manufacture, rather, of silk. There it is today. Victor Hugo, the author of Les Miserables, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, actually lived right there. And in 1980, first time I spent any time in Paris, I realized one of these was for sale for $80,000. Today, that same building would cost about $4 million. I wish I had bought it, but I didn't have $80,000. Pretty good investment. Today, of course, the ground floor arcades are art galleries and expensive restaurants and all kinds of things like that. Here, I just wanted to show it in 1931. I just liked the sort of romance of that photograph. I could sort of imagine myself sitting there drinking very strong coffee or a Cote de Rhone, smoking a Gauloise, waiting on the Germans to come or something, right? I mean, it's sort of, Edith Piaf is singing in the background or something. And that's what it looks like today. The space is used as a public park. It's actually quite beautiful. There we see the pavilion of the Queen, now a hotel, and the detailed aerial photograph of it, unified in the front, but a little messy in the back. Out front, fine silk, and in the back, tuberculosis. Subsequent to this, a variety of royal places would continue to be built. First is the Place de Victory that we see here, which today is really not a place, it's sort of a roundabout. It's just an intersection of 6 or 7 streets coming together. The one that is significant is the Place Vendôme, again here with the statue of an equestrian statue of Louis XIV. Now, if you'll notice, Henry IV was more or less life-size. By the time of his son, Louis XIII, he's a little bit bigger than life-size. By the time of Louis XIV, he's the size of this room, right? Even though in real life he was 5'4". And here he is on his horse. This will ultimately be torn down during the Revolution, and a column will be erected by Napoleon, which guess what it looks like? The column of Trajan. And then when Napoleon falls into disfavor and is sent into exile, that column is pulled down, and then it keeps flipping back and forth. Now, the interesting thing about and we'll get to that in a moment, but the interesting thing about it, again, it's a speculative real estate development. So I'm going to end this today talking about this, and then we'll come back and pick up Place Vendôme and the larger point that I want to make about these royal places, okay, other than the ones I've already made. This is the Palais Cardinal, built by Cardinal Richelieu. As I said, Hollywood has treated him poorly in stories like The Three Musketeers. He was actually an extraordinary man, brilliant, in fact, and actually held things together. That's the best way I can put it, and sort of laid the groundwork for, even though he was a Roman Catholic cardinal, laid the groundwork for the emergence of the modern nation. And this was the palace that he built for himself, but he built it in this Italianate style in a way to try to demonstrate the sort of proper way of building this to the nobility. It had a large garden in the back, and in the early part of the 19th century, these residential wings were added a la Place de Vosges with ground floor arcades with shops and so forth. The famous Colette lived right there. And this became then the center of Parisian society as it emerged in the middle of the 19th century. This was actually built by Rambuteau. And there we see the gardens today with this pleached allays. More on that later. It's an extraordinary process of pruning these. It comes from viticulture, by the way. And this is what the Palais Royal looks like today. And there we see the Place de Victory at the top with all these sort of intersecting streets coming in. And then the Palais Royal here and the Tuileries that we see down here in the lower part. So we will come back. We will end that today. And on Friday, I will discuss the Place Vendôme. And then we will see the way in which, before you leave, we will see the way in which both these vary from the sort of larger notions that Sixtus V had, then how in the subsequent century, in the 17th century, how André Le Nôtre, during the reign of Louis XIV, will attempt to put all this together. And in so doing, will actually set precedents that then will carry forward into the 19th century when Baron Georges Eugène Haussmann and the Second Empire will remake the entire city. To talk about the Place Vendôme, and the major point that I want to make about this, which is that each of these projects are individual projects. And what we do not see is actually the connection. Now, there were ideas about this and there were plans for this, but it would take another 200 to 300 years. In fact, it would not be until the middle of the 19th century that all of the straight streets and so forth would actually be implemented that connected these up into a single unified field that is the Paris that we know today. The last of these royal places that we will talk about is Place Vendôme, which is in some ways the most peculiar. It's a quite complex story because it was actually property that was owned by the Duc de Vendôme, who ultimately owed money to the crown to settle the debt. The land then was purchased or given to the king, who then, on what was called a concession basis, similar to what we see in the Place Dauphine, where the king owned the land and then had an agent who developed it, and then the king got a certain percentage for fronting the money and putting up the land. In fact, it would not be until the 19th century that capital formation in the modern sense would come into being. That is, private people investing in something. This was a sort of hybrid, and it's a long and a complex story, and for the purposes of this course, we don't need to sort of understand all the background of it. But I want to point out a few things that will make it somewhat interesting. The first is that you'll notice this enormous equestrian statue of King Louis XIV in the center of this place. And then you'll notice in the place today, there is actually something that looks an awful lot like Trajan's column. The column replaced the statue after the revolution of 1789 and the coup d'etat that put Napoleon I in power. The column was then erected by Napoleon, in which all the cannon that he used from all of his famous battles were melted down to create this bas-relief in metal that wraps it a la the column of Trajan. And of course, rather than having Trajan and then later St. Peter on top of the column, we have the Emperor Napoleon. Napoleon, however, fell into disgrace and was sent into exile. And it would not be until his reputation was sort of rehabilitated during the Second Empire after 1851 that we would have the column re-erected in its form today. There we actually see the statue of the king destroyed, first in the Revolution of 1789, replaced by the column in 1802, and the column pulled down in the Revolution of 1848, and then rebuilt during the Second Empire between 1851 and 1879. This is actually of the first column that was pulled down from this old daguerreotype from the Revolution of 1848, known as the First Paris Commune. That gave us, by the way, the term avant-garde because it referred to the advanced sort of uprising, people in the barricades here that where streets were blocked. And this is foreshadowing because it will play into the story of the Second Empire in the 19th century, in which the straight streets were cut through the city in part to move troops and to prevent riots from breaking out, as they were wont to do in France between the end of the revolution, the coup d'etat that put Napoleon in power, and then the stability that finally came in the Second Empire of 1851 under Louis Napoleon. However, the Paris that we know today, the Paris that we love, the Paris that has 64 million tourists a year, or whatever it is, it's some enormous number. Sort of the entire population of Spain ultimately visits Paris. Not actually Spaniards, but that number of people visit the city every year. It's one of the great cities of the world, I think, and it is a long and complex story. I thought you'd like to see it in 1944 during the Nazi occupation. And at the time that this was built, by the way, all of these ground floor arcades that you see in these sort of regulated heights are not there. That will not come until the 19th century. And but it's based, the 19th century city is really based upon these precedents that were set in motion by Henry IV, carried out all the way through into the reign of Louis XIV, who was on the throne for 60 years and consolidated the monarchy finally into the modern nation state. And those precedents actually were sort of exploited to some degree by the landscape gardener the landscape architect, I think we would call him today, Andre Lenote. And this lecture is ostensibly about that. So Place Vendôme as it appears today. Now, it turns out that in the long and complex story that created Place Vendôme, they ran out of money and they didn't have enough capital to actually fund the construction of the whole thing. So the architect, Jules Ardouin Mansart, actually constructed only the facades of the buildings. So if you sort of look at this, you can see these regularized facades here, but you will notice in the back that actually they're all different in the back. Different buildings are attaching to that facade. And that is not unusual if we really think about it. It seems peculiar to us today that we would build something like that. But if we were in Atlanta, someone was to build a new subdivision of single family houses somewhere out in the suburbs. Typically, they would buy a piece of land. They would put in what? They would put in the infrastructure. You would put in the streets. You would put in the sewer. You'd put in the utility. And then you would subdivide the land into a series of lots. And then you would sell the lot so that the developer's end product is the improved lot. The lot would then be acquired not by an individual, most likely, but by a builder who might build in any given year 5, 6, 7 houses. Right? There are some builders who will build the whole thing out as one single development, but that's less than 10% of all new single-family home construction in the United States, which is built by people who are essentially small businessmen, sort of entrepreneurs who are building fewer than 7 houses per year. That's an extraordinary thing. So if we just take those lots, those improved lots, subdivision, and we elevate them to a designed facade, what we have in effect is this, so that you could buy segments of the subdivided facade, right? And then you could build whatever you wanted to build in the back. And if you look at this actually carefully, what you will see is that the firewalls and the divisions and the chimneys and so forth actually are at different intervals in relation to the facade because of that peculiar circumstance. I think it's actually an extraordinary story, but from an urban design standpoint, it is irrelevant actually, at least in the purpose of this course. Now, we talked about these boulevards that came roughly at the same time that the city was expanding and the royal plazas initially began under Henry IV. This space at the base of the wall, which was then, when the wall came down, converted into a street. And because the walls were circumferential, as Wycherley says, loosely, like the Greek city, loosely flung about the city, and the walls keep expanding as the city expands, the defensive walls. When the interior walls came down, they were replaced by these circumferential streets. These will become known as the boulevard, It's a French word, French term, and there is a corresponding term, which we will see the origins of today, which is called the avenue. Now, today, and actually going all the way back to the 18th century in England, these terms get confused and they get conflated. And boulevards today sort of mean something with trees planted down the middle or something. And avenue and boulevard are actually conflated and hopelessly confused. But they were initially very different streets that had different social, economic, and political purposes. The avenue is simply a contraction of a apostrophe venue, to a place, to a venue. So that Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. does what? It connects the Capitol building to the White House, the legislative branch of government to the executive branch of government, the avenue, right? The boulevard, because it was associated with the space at the base of the wall and was a wide street that then was built after the wall came down, is actually circumferential. So what you have is something like a wagon wheel with spokes, the avenues being the spokes and the rim actually being the boulevard. As I said today, there's even a street in Atlanta just called Boulevard. There's even a Boulevard Street. And in the history of names, that's probably in the top 5, I think, of all time oxymoronic names of Boulevard Street. It's sort of like if I was speaking Chinese, it would be the Lushan Mountains, where Shan is mountain. Okay, it's bizarre, like jumbo shrimp. It doesn't make sense. So, so Atlanta, of course, is a perfect example of of bizarre names having 71 streets with Peachtree in it, which I'm convinced was created. There's even a West Peachtree, by the way, which is east of Peachtree. Think about that for a moment. And talk about confusing, particularly I think it was to confuse either the carpetbaggers that were coming down from the north or the pizza delivery guys in some prescient way that they could not possibly have foreseen. That's supposed to be sort of funny, not really, but kind of. Anyway, so what we have then at the beginning of the reign of Louis XIV in 1661 is actually a series of these small projects: Place Dauphine, Place de Vosges, Place de Victory, the great palace here of Palais Cardinal, renamed Palais Royal. And a couple of you after class were confused. Place Royal, after the revolution, is renamed Place des Vosges. This makes no sense. And Richelieu's palace, which was the Palais Cardinal, because he was a cardinal, was renamed Palais Royal during the reign of Louis Philippe. After the revolution, there was a brief restoration of the monarchy, and the royal family moved into it. And actually, Louis XIII moved into it, as a matter of fact. And so it was renamed the Palace Royal. It's a little confusing. Place Vendôme, which we've already discussed, and then the Tuileries, which was a garden, we'll see in a moment more of, which was associated with the extension of the Louvre that was constructed originally by the first Italian queen, Catherine de' Medici, who preceded Marie and who was married to an earlier king, Henry II, in the middle of the 16th century, who preceded Henry IV. Now, what you'll notice about this, there are other ones that are proposed, never built, that we see here. What you'll notice about this is that although there are proposed extensions of streets that we see here from these ronds-points, round points, or to use the French term star, étoile, the streets don't connect up to anything because actually they had to cut through the fabric of the city. And as I said, it would take about 200 years to actually achieve that. But the point I want to make is that the precedents for what Haussmann and in the Second Empire will do between 1851 and 1879 is already set. And there are the beginnings of this that occur with the extension of an axis out of the Tuileries Garden across an open field, which was known as the Elysian Fields. In French, that is the Champs-Élysées, and that would be known as the Avenue des Champs-Élysées, one of the most famous streets in the world. There we see an aerial photograph of it just so that you can see the way that these remain, even today, somewhat isolated and embedded within the fabric of the city overall. This is Place de Victory that we see here. This is Place Dauphine, very prominent there because of its position in relation to the Pont Neuf. And here, Place des Vosges. And then we see the Tuileries over here. This is the Louvre. There is the Cour de Logis, or the original building is still embedded within there that was built by Philippe Auguste in the 13th century outside the wall of the city. Then the extension that we see here, and a palace that was constructed across here, now missing, now torn down, burned down in the Revolution of 1871, the end of the Second Empire. The garden, as we'll see, was actually associated with that palace, thus the Palais de Tuileries and the Jardin des Tuileries, the garden of the Tuileries. It's called Tuileries because there were clay deposits there in the old floodplain of the Seine, and it's where they dug that clay out to make roofing tiles, thus Tuileries. Place Dauphine, Place de Vosges, Place de Victory, Place Vendôme, Palais Cardinal, Palais Royal today.